Hey, nerds. So, going to continue my series here on philosophical fragments from Plato to Foucault by Peter Sloterdijk. And oh yeah, I should mention keep forgetting to mention. So, please, in the description of the video, if you're buying anything at all from Amazon, click the link that I'll put for some old philosophy book in the description. And then if you're buying anything at all on Amazon anyway, you can give me a little kickback. That's a way to contribute to me without costing you any extra money at all. And also, please subscribe. And if you want to give me money, check out my Patreon. All of those links are in the description. All right. So, anyway, Peter Sloterdijk, I wouldn't say he's necessarily an actual post-structuralist, but he's like he's pretty sympathetic toward post-structuralism, and he talks about, post-structuralists like Foucault's ideas a lot, and then the ancient Greek philosophers, obviously, like Plato. And remember, post-structuralism is not the same as postmodernism, which is oft endlessly strawmanned by people like Jordan Peterson. And even Foucault and Derrida actually disagreed a lot, even though people like Jordan Peterson lumped them together all the time, but they disagreed majorly, particularly as one of many examples on religion, the idea of this post-structuralist idea, which was attached to them after, because when they were asked separately about these in interviews, they had never heard the terms either postmodernism or post-structuralism. But in terms of religion and deconstruction, Derrida was more sympathetic to religion, which caused me to, I don't know whether I invented this word, but I use the word indeconstructible, which is basically the idea that he thinks that God is the only thing that cannot be deconstructed. And Foucault was definitely more of an atheist, and he deconstructed God all the time. Well, not all the time, but in general. And so, anyway, we're going to get into here Peter Sloterdijk talking about Nietzsche's opinions on Plato. It's actually a pretty counterintuitive opinion for Nietzsche, I would say, because a lot of people know that Nietzsche literally wrote a book called The Antichrist and was extremely a militant atheist, especially towards Christianity, way before the term militant atheist even existed. And so we're going to get into Nietzsche talking about here. I forgot to look up before I started this. Is Plato Christian? Because he calls Plato Christian in this quote, and I don't know if that actually is true, because I think the Greek religion preceded Christianity, right? Yeah, like he's kind of using that in a Nietzsche way, like oversimplifying religion into Christianity, seemingly. Obviously, the molding, like, combination, I should say, of Platonism and Christianity became Neoplatonism, and so that's an entirely different thing. But he's sort of separating those two. But it's Nietzsche. He writes in a provocative way, deliberately, obviously. Okay, so anyway, we'll get into the clip here. In the famous 334th aphorism of his Gay Science, he means happy science, entitled, "In what we too are still pious," the anti-Platonist Friedrich Nietzsche erected a monument. So, anti-Platonist, very hostile toward Plato, disagreed with many of his opinions, but is giving him credit where actually is giving him like a surprisingly enormous agreement to Plato here. Okay, so the anti-Platonist Friedrich Nietzsche erected a monument, as honorific as it is problematic, to the founder of the Athenian Academy. Quote, "But you will have gathered what I am getting at, namely that it is still a metaphysical faith upon which our faith in science rests." So, obviously Nietzsche was very anti-religious. He thought that metaphysics is dead, basically. But I'm reminded, I think it was Heidegger, but don't quote me on that, who said that like metaphysics can never be killed, basically. And I think he was actually kind of right about that. You don't have to be a religious person to say that. Like, I don't believe in God or anything, but you can say that arguably there are metaphysical way, like metaphysics exists, but that doesn't mean that what he is about to say is necessarily true either, but it's surprising. So anyway, I'll continue the quote here. Quote, "But you will have gathered what I am getting at, namely that it is still a metaphysical faith upon which our faith and science rest, that even if we know of today, we godless anti-metaphysicians still take our fire too from the flame lit by the 1,000-year-old faith, the Christian faith, which was also Plato's faith, that God is truth, that truth is divine." See, that like a lot of that sounds like Jordan Peterson, eh? Like thinking that no one can be an atheist, everything rests on a bedrock of Christianity, science rests on a bedrock of Christianity. This frankly dumb opinion, really. Um, okay, so basically he's saying, even though actually he was kind of like Nietzsche was more pro science than pro religion, but he was actually kind of anti science and anti religion too. So he's very critical of science. So it makes sense that he would say that science rests on faith since he was critical of science. So, but he's 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 not exactly making like the Petersonian argument that science is religious, but you could say that he's making that claim, and I would agree. Like I've said many times before that science can be really biased, even as biased as religion sometimes, but the overwhelming majority of the time science is nowhere near as biased as religion. But it depends on the religion type of religion you're talking about, right? There are plenty of religious scientists who can separate their religion from their science, but that doesn't really matter as much. So we godless anti-metaphysicians, so related to Nietzsche's so-called death of God, really meaning that referring to the secularization of culture during the Enlightenment Europe, basically, that people became less religious during the Enlightenment. They believed more in like science and truth and all that kind of stuff. So people still followed religion, but they believed less in like miracles and that kind of shit, right? Um, so the Christian, this is interesting. So, like I said, the flame lit by the 1,000-year-old faith, the Christian faith, which was also Plato's faith, that God is truth, that truth is divine. So this is like sort of a Jordan Peterson statement too, but he's actually criticizing that really because he's saying like this is the way scientists think. So it's kind of his takedown of science, right? Okay, so like, and as I said, Plato wasn't actually a Christian because his views preceded Christianity. I'm not sure if I used the right word there, but basically, like a lot of ancient Greek religions, and as many people know, countless other religions are what Christianity stole from when it became Christianity. Although, like there's nothing wrong with being a Christian, obviously. But anyway, that God is truth, the truth is divine. This is the kind of like logos thing that Jordan Peterson talks about, right? That logos is truth and God is truth and truth is divine. That's kind of like a circular argument, right? God is truth, truth is divine. So if you're defining God as truth and you're defining truth as God and you're defining truth as divine, then it's impossible for truth to not be God because truth is divine. It's impossible for God to not be true because true is divine and truth is divine and God is truth and truth is divine. You see how this is like endlessly circular logic? Like you can believe in truth, but I agree with more of like a Nietzschean, not well, actually Nietzschean, but even more particularly Foucaultian argument. You could say that, like, or actually also Richard Rorty too, my favorite pragmatist, who's also an atheist, who has the opinion when asked if you believe in God, he says, "Who cares?" And also, like, basically the points that I'm talking about are that truth is kind of overrated. Like, truth is important often, but it's sure as like it's in my opinion, it's sure as fuck not divine. Like, it's not that important sometimes. A lot of the time, maybe even most of the time, it is. Sometimes it's not. People exaggerate, is conspiracy theorists in particular, how often, like how seldomly you should value it, but it is overrated sometimes. Anyway, even extremely overrated. Okay, so that God is truth, the truth is divine. But what if this were to become more and more difficult to believe? One might imagine the history of European philosophy is a relay race in which a torch lit by Plato and a few of his predecessors. That's basically, I forget who it was, but there's a philosopher who has the famous quote, all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. Obviously, that's kind of a massive oversimplification, and I disagree with because it's gone in all of sorts of different directions. But it's an interesting opinion, especially for Nietzsche himself to say, since he was an anti-Platonist, right? So imagine the history of European philosophy is a relay race in which a torch lit by Plato and a few of his predecessors, chiefly Parmenides and Heraclitus, was passed down from one generation to the next. That's interesting that he mentions Parmenides and Heraclitus because they were obviously pre-Socratics, and their thoughts came before Plato's thoughts, and his philosophy built on their philosophy. And I think they were actually even more interesting than the Socratics, like Plato and Socrates, whether he existed or not. Heraclitus, in particular, I find really interesting. His opinions on metaphysics. I don't remember that many details, but he'd be interesting to investigate his views more too. So anyway, that's the end of the paragraph. And yeah, this is a really interesting book by Peter Sloterdijk. He's examining the opinion, basically the history of philosophy from Plato to Foucault, and sort of like the evolution of Plato's thoughts on metaphysics into Nietzsche heavily criticizing metaphysics, but also agreeing that people get like metaphysical about science, meaning that probably to him that people are equally like ideological about them. But obviously he was critical of both of them. I think he slightly respected science more, but obviously, like I said, he was highly critical of both religion and science. So that's why I find it really interesting in this paragraph that Nietzsche, literally the Antichrist, admits that Plato is right and that science rests on a bedrocks of metaphysics. So to Nietzsche, according to Sloterdijk, even Nietzsche, the Antichrist, says science rests on a bedrock of metaphysics.